And now, it's time for talk.
Tonight we're going to look at the history of southeast Missouri and the history of Dunklin County, Missouri, 1845 to 1895. These were books loaned to me by local people here in town, and I have put them to great use. We want to talk to you tonight about the early roads in Dunklin County, in fact the early history of roads in southeast Missouri, specifically Dunklin County. The very first roads, of course, were its waterways, were Missouri's waterways, and I'm talking about the Mississippi and the St. Francis. Of course, all these were used for years. They were easily accessible and were already there. But when men began to push back into the interior, they found a ready-made system there. There were natural paths stamped by buffalo hooves and deer herds, and these in turn were used by the Indians. And we have many of their trails have become our major highways. 9 Indian trails penetrated into almost every area of early Missouri. In fact, history says that in 1530 DeSoto marched along some of these boot heel trails, which in his writings were called obscure paths. Now, it would be a mistake to suppose that these trails or traces or paths were like we think of today as early roads. In fact, you could hardly see them. They may have been overhung with branches. They may have been obscured. A map from the Indian Trails and Warpaths out of Hawk's History of Missouri would show some of these early trails, Indian trails, as they cut across the state. As we said, there were 9 of them. Now, this one is an enlargement of those trails, and you see here Dunklin County. Of course, Dunklin County is this shape because of the water, because of the swampland, and we will do that when we do drainage. We will tell you more about what this land looked like. But you see here the old Shawnee Trail that comes up through southeast Missouri. It goes up to Dexter, and then it goes across to Cape Girardeau. It was a Shawnee Trail. There is another that we'll talk about, which was an Indian trail, also a Shawnee Trail that came up what we now know as Highway 55. Both of them were original Indian trails. Within 30 years after the original Louisiana Purchase, Indians had given up every title to every foot of land they had owned in Missouri that they had maintained and kept and used since time immemorial. A little sad to think about. The first really white man's road in the southeast Missouri area was called the 3-Notch Road. It was a little short thing. It was totally developed by white men in the Missouri Territory. 3 notches were cut in trees all along the road, and of course the Indians had discovered the lead and mineral deposits down here at Mine Lamont at Potosi, Missouri. So in 1718, the French were already really gouging out some 1,500 pounds of lead a day. And the town which sprang up right here on the river was St. Genevieve. And the heavy traffic in lead and miners and all the provisions that moved up and down moved it from a trail to a trace to a full-fledged road. The 3-Notch Road was the first road. The second road that was really developed and came into prominence in southeast Missouri really was the first commissioned road still by the territory. Of course, in the 1770s, the Spaniards took over control, and the county was still sparsely settled, and nobody really worried about settling down. It was mostly trappers and traders. St. Louis to St. Genevieve, and both of those were the only permanent settlements, and so traffic between those two was at a maximum. The New Madrid settlement came on in 1785, and then Cape in 1793. And by 1808, they needed a new road to link all of these settlements together. And so it was legislated by the territorial governor that there would be a road that would run from St. Louis through the major settlements all the way down to New Madrid. Now, the French influence up here called this La Rue Royale, which means the Royal Road. And from St. Genevieve on down to New Madrid, the Spanish influence called it El Camino Real, which meant the King's Highway, of course. Now, despite the grandiose name that this road had, it was a real challenge to travelers because it had stumps and mud, and the state placed responsibility for the maintenance of this road on the every male, all able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 45 shall work on the construction. That's what the legislation said, but of course when you place it that vague, it just doesn't really get done. Legal specifications read, the road shall be 20 feet wide, cleared of trees and brush, and no stump shall be left above 12 inches. Now, that was rather interesting, stumps above 12 inches, and we have here a picture of downtown Cardwell from the English collection. Many of you are familiar with that, but I want you to look at the size of the stumps. Look how the horses would have had to pick. There was a path that a carriage could go. Horses, of course, all right, but 12 inches in height is quite some height. Here is the Methodist Church in Cardwell under construction. But the shot of that road was an incredible shot to me, to think of a road like that today, and we're going to talk about some interesting things before this program is over. This is a map of the original survey of Dunklin County in 1843. You have Dunklin County here for your orientation. Here is the St. Francis River, and here is Little River, which we know as the floodway ditches today. Between those two was often wet and marshy the whole time. That's why Dunklin County has this shape, of course, as we've said. But there was a sand ridge. You can see on this original survey map the words Grand Prairie. That's in the Caruth area. And you see here the outline of the one road that was in Dunklin County in 1843. This is the Shawnee Trail that we showed you, the Indian Trail. It came up from Hornersville, Caruth, Kennett. It entered Kennett at the site of the hospital. It went north out of Kennett past the Oak Ridge Cemetery across the spreads of the Chili-de-Caw, or the Chili-de-Caw River, where Highway 25 now crosses it. It went on to Clarkton. Clarkton was on the edge of what was known as East Swamp, and it was fearsome. East Swamp ran into Lake McCormy about here, and then there was water everywhere. Then it went on up to Cotton Hill to Dexter, and you could go to the Mississippi River if you had to haul your produce that way. It was a long route. There was another road to the south. Now here is Kennett, and here is Hornersville for your orientation. Starting in this area, this is the area of Caruth. This was Prairie. This is Grand Prairie. Caruth was not located on this map, not even formed. The road sagged down. It came by Lulu, by Paulding, and it crossed into the Cockrum opening and the Cockrum settlement southwest of Cardwell and went into Arkansas. Now there was one in the summertime. There was one other road that went across East Swamp, which came down the eastern section of Missouri in the Little River, Hornersville area, of course. You could go across Hickory Landing, you could go to Denton, you could go to Holland, which was called Middleburg at that time, and you came out at Cottonwood Point on the Mississippi River. But that's only, to get across the Penobscot Bayou was fearsome at that point. Now, north of Kennett, we're in the Clarkton area, and you see a place called Beach, which later became Clarkton. They were practically the same thing, but someone got the idea to get across East Swamp, which ran the length of Dunklin County. Some people read it Lake McCormy, and some surveys call it the same thing. Of building a wooden road. Wooden roads look like the answer to everyone's problem. Timber was cheap and plentiful, and it was going to be easy to construct a road that ran from Clarkton across East Swamp, across all of this swampy mass, to get to Weaverville, which is now Bokerton, and then on to one of the arms of the inlets to Portage Bay, to Portageville area. That way you would not have to go all the way to Cape to haul your cotton or whatever else you needed to get to the Mississippi. And there was what was called a plank road mania, to build a road across East Swamp out of wood. And it sounded great, but they were really doomed. The planks sank into the mud, or they curled up like pork rinds in wet weather, and the streams would wash away sometimes 200 feet of the road, And history says, depending on whether you're a Democrat or Republican, history said the road was burned by Federals during the Civil War, and some people say, well, it was, and it was burned by the Confederate soldiers. That's it just depends on whose history you read. It was later rebuilt with poles. They didn't give up on the plank road. It was rebuilt with poles, and it was called the corduroy road. But they were doomed. They carried a lot more high hopes than they ever carried materials, and were doomed from the very start. Now, I read an interesting definition that as late as 1900, the definition of a Midland good road, I wrote it down, let me read it to you. If the mud does not quite get over your boot tops when you sit in the saddle. Now that was a Midland good road. The history of Highway 84 is an interesting study. We've talked about the boot heel, and we've talked about the fact that we were isolated here in Dunklin County from every direction except up this sand ridge north to the Mississippi River. But the idea was started that if we could just get across this east swamp and Lake Nicorme and all of this mass of swamp and rivers that were here, we could go. The real start of Highway 84 was in 1917. The State Penal Board sent 60 convicts from the penitentiary to work on it. They cleared the right-of-way, they graded, they aided everything that was needed in building bridges across the floodways. They had their own tents and the guards, and the state fed them. The Dunklin County part was quite expensive because of the gumbo and the bridges. You had the Chillicothe River, you had Cypress Slough, you had Taylor Slough, you had Lost River, all to cross before you even got to the floodway ditches. And as one writer said, Cypress Slough and Lost River would mire a snipe, much less a tractor and heavy equipment. And farmers are still, they say, farmers are still plowing up boots that were lost back in the building of the floodway ditches. That's probably an exaggeration. But this was a terrible morass of water, and of course one solid expanse at the right time of year. Now, Dunklin County, of course, had a very expensive part to do its part and get to the river, and Pemiscot County Court decided to abandon their part of this because it was just too expensive. Dunklin County was determined to go ahead, so they said, all right, we're going to build our part whether or no. There was not such a thing as state aid in that time. And you just give us a Y. We're going to build our part to right over here. You just give us a Y for turnaround privileges on your side. But look how nice it would be if we could say, we have down here in the Boot Hill the first road all the way across the state of Missouri. Well, I don't know what the powers that be were, but the Pemiscot County officials thought about having that road all the way across the state of Missouri. And they decided they'd go on with their part. No one ever dreamed, of course, that the road would ever be paved, as it is now, and we get in our car and zoom across to Caruthersville in no time. But you can't realize that just a few short years ago, I can't realize, a few short years ago, that was impossible. Just a bit tonight of the history of the early roads in Dunklin County. It's been fascinating. The drainage thing that had to go on before those roads could be built is even more interesting to me, and perhaps next time we can hit that.
Watching Time for Talk.